Hello and welcome to this launch webinar for the 2021 Verfassungsblog Power and the COVID-19 Pandemic Symposium. I am privileged and delighted to be the convener of the symposium, which began on Monday. Since then, we've published 6 country reports on Australia, Brazil, Finland, Singapore, Sweden, and Thailand. We have another 7 weeks of country reports from countries throughout the world. We have over 100 academics and experts contributing to this, all with the central question of how has COVID-19 impacted us, impacted our rights, impacted our legal systems, looking at it through the perspective of the rule of law, of democracy, of human rights. I am delighted that we are supported by Democracy Reporting International under the Reconstitution Project, the EU-funded Horizon 2020 project, Reconnect, the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law, and I also have a fantastic colleague with me from Middlesex University, London, who is making sure that we have no technical issues today. The impetus, the reason that we are running this symposium is because of the need for global comparative legal analysis, not only to be highlighting the deeply concerning developments going on throughout the world, but also to be looking for the good practices, the best practices that can help us identify and move forward in the best responses to this pandemic. I am privileged to be joined by 4 fantastic speakers today, representing, I think all of us are representing 5 different countries and 4 different time zones. Again, showing the depth of this global symposium and this global webinar. I'm very sorry and sad to say that one of our speakers, our first speaker, Professor Fanulili Aulon, is unable to join us today because of a family health issue. And I know I speak on behalf of the panel when I wish them well. I would first, on this point, like to say a few technical points. First, for all our attendees on the webinar, please make use of the Q&A function. We're going to have a long Q&A session with our panelists at the end of our speakers. And also, if you're joining us live from the Verfassungsblog, first off, welcome. But second, if you'd like to go to Twitter, you can also ask questions of the panel using the hashtag #PowerAndPandemic. Let me just say again before I welcome our first speaker, it is a joy, a privilege, and a delight for me to be convening this symposium and also to be welcoming you all to this global webinar. Our speakers will have 10 minutes to speak on a range of transversal issues affecting the globe, but also in particular, looking at issues affecting their countries. I would first like to call on our wonderful first speaker, Professor Martin Scheinin, to begin our panel. Martin.
Thank you very much, Joel, and everybody. Welcome to this symposium, which hopefully will be as great as we have all promised it will be. I will be addressing a small country, Finland, which has both best practice and problems in combating COVID, but I will more than that address the question of how to assess national strategies against COVID-19 from the perspective of compliance with human rights. I prepared a couple of slides and allow me to play the it's always in a different place where it was. I hope you have my slides now. First of all, it's a pity Fionnuala Niolainen is not with us, because she's my successor as UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism. And I think there are important analogies between the fight against COVID and the fight against terrorism. And one of them, which is most concerning, is that even if both are genuine and serious threats, COVID is much worse. The death toll already is 100-fold as compared to the annual loss of lives because of terrorism. Every day of the pandemic is as worse as the worst day of terrorism, 9/11, 2001. And we haven't seen the end. I think today marks the day when we reach 2.5 million deaths to COVID-19 globally. And the pace currently is 500,000 every 1 month and 10 days. We may have reached the plateau, but it's not over. And this means that during 2021, we might have as many as 10 million deaths. Nothing in modern history besides the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919 compares to what we are going through today. That means that democracy, rule of law, and human rights are under serious challenge. And we constitutionalists, we human rights experts, we must acknowledge that the threat is serious and the response must be proportionate. About Finland, it is a small country which is often named as a European or Western champion in the fight against COVID. And it may be true, Finland has succeeded to cope with this catastrophe. I use the slogan, soft measures, respect for the rule of law, and plenty of good luck. I believe there are elements of luck in how different countries at different stages have been confronted with the epidemic, but it is true that the numbers in Finland have remained comparatively low, both what comes to cases and what comes to deaths. It is a valid question. Do we praise countries for their geographical location and good luck? And I think the honest answer in the field of human rights is yes, that's what we do constantly. We praise countries who manage to comply with human rights because they are rich, because they have a uniform, isolated population, they have natural resources, and they have accumulated wealth, sometimes collected through human rights abuses. But today they get praise for compliance for human rights because of the situation they are in. I don't think it's wrong to say that countries that have good luck and good, let's say, objective preconditions do merit some praise for coping with COVID and not making the situation worse. But there's more to it than just good luck. I think there are reasons to say that Finland does represent actual best practice. First, it has stuck to the principle of normalcy as a lodestar in the early invocation of emergency powers, but then using those emergency powers to rapidly restore normalcy. I do not say that the use of emergency powers in March, June last year was the last occasion. In fact, the discourse in Finland all the time reminds the population that we may be facing new use of emergency powers if the epidemic continues. Secondly, Finland has a strong advanced scrutiny of legality and constitutionality of most measures taken in response to COVID. And this means that even the most advanced judicial systems of the world are lagging behind because courts will address the issues ex post facto, whereas in this particular situation, the Finnish system with emphasis of advanced scrutiny of legality and constitutionality, both within government and by parliament, has proved its strength in an acute crisis. And that's related to the third merit, exemplary parliamentary and expert review of human rights conformity of the measures. And this is related to the institution called the Constitutional Law Committee of Parliament, which in turn hears constitutional law professors, who in turn are commented upon by other scholars in a real-time blog which follows the events. This experience hasn't been without problems. One issue where I've been myself highly critical is that Finland de facto closed its borders, including internal EU borders, without a legal basis, proper legal basis. It was a very creative and I would say unlawful interpretation of the law that allowed the border guard agency de facto to close borders. And technically, this has escaped review of legality because of government calling these measures simply recommendations. Finally, this is now being addressed through the introduction of mandatory testing and quarantine at airports and other border control posts. But it has taken a long time before this situation has emerged. And second critical point is that many measures by Finland are far too relaxed in proportion to the seriousness of the threat. What comes to face masks, restaurants, religious gatherings, construction sites, shipyards, Finland has relied on its good luck and geographical isolation. And with the new virus variants since Christmas, it may be facing serious problems. And I wouldn't exclude new invocation of a state of emergency precisely because of the situation created by these fairly relaxed measures. And that's one reason why local elections scheduled for April are suddenly now at risk, which comes seemingly as a surprise to the government. And that, of course, is a democracy issue. Combating COVID is also a battle between epistemic communities. And there's a lot of difference in the responses. Human rights courts and treaty bodies may defer to domestic courts. Domestic courts refer to the executive or to experts. Governments defer to their experts, who often are technocrat physicians, whose old dogma may shield hidden strategic choices, or may not even be evidence-based in respect of this particular pandemic. And one important question that should be asked constantly is whether a national strategy is based on protecting ICU capacity, or is it based on saving lives? Do all lives count equally? This is a root cause for what I would call the failure in Sweden, where the whole strategy has been based on saving ICU capacity, and lives over 80 didn't matter. And epidemiological modeling is a source of power in combating this particular type of a crisis. I'd like to remind that epidemiology is also a social science. It's highly related to the behavior of people, behavior of populations. It's not simply a question of how the virus behaves. It's much more a question of how people behave. Further, the behavioral turn in economics may again increase the power of economists as another epistemic community. And notably, economists are not only a scholarly scientific community, but there are huge economic, financial, business interests involved in the messaging of economists. And one could say that while the epidemiologists close down society, economists are driving opening up, and often far too early. There are, however, issues where lawyers and particularly human rights experts have a role as a third epistemic community. Issues such as positive human rights obligations under the right to life and right to health, necessity towards a legitimate aim, proportionality of resulting interferences, are issues to be addressed by lawyers, or more broadly, human rights experts, and the other epistemic communities are not equally well placed to talking that language. We see lawyers interfering with what epidemiologists are saying, but equally, epidemiologists think that they know what laws should be used and what responses might be proportionate. Here I'd like to advertise this EUI working paper published with my junior colleague Helga Molbäck-Stensig, where we look into the question of how to assess human rights compliance of responses to COVID. The online link to the publication is on the screen, but I will also share these slides on Twitter so you don't have to write down. This working paper includes our model for assessing the human rights compatibility of strategy against COVID. And I have, for this presentation, consolidated it to a single graph, single slide, where on top we have 4 categories of human rights or human rights issues: positive obligations, negative obligations, equality and non-discrimination, and rule of law dimension of human rights. The methodology of assessing compliance with these 4 baskets is collection of empirical data, use of structural process and outcome indicators, expert assessment by recognized country experts recruited from existing networks, and then giving marks 0 to 10 for 3 items each in these 4 baskets. So there are simply 12 questions asked to the experts related to aspects of rights within these 4 categories. Each of them then including certain weighting within the basket and resulting in 4 separate grades. The baskets are treated equally in the sense that the overall grade is simply an average of the 4 grades, resulting as weighted sums of the marks given for 3 questions each. But notably, failing within one basket means failing in the overall score as well. And this reminds me from my old school experience more than 50 years ago, where failing one subject means that you have to repeat the whole class. I think the biggest human rights challenge and biggest challenge to the human rights assessment of strategies against COVID is in the reconciliation between the first 2 pillars, the yellow and the blue. How do we simultaneously assess how countries comply with the positive obligation to protect life and protect health, and how do we curtail their interferences, their restrictions upon civil and political rights? Equality and non-discrimination is also important. Rule of law dimension, including legal basis and use of emergency powers, is also important. But I think the big challenge, and hopefully a lot of interesting data will result from the 2 first baskets. I close by saying that the collection of country assessments has been launched, and I have about 12 in the pipeline, and the call is still open, and I hope the panelists will help me in recruiting more volunteer country experts. I do not want myself to handpick the experts, but I want them to come from existing expert networks with expertise both on COVID-19 and the country's legal system, so that we can have a recognized expertise as basis for the marking. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the other panelists and the discussion.
Thank you, Martin. I would keenly recommend reading Martin's paper and also get in touch with him, because this is a very important study going forward. I'd also have a further pitch that you should read Martin's fantastic report on Finland, which was published online on the Verfassungsblog yesterday. Could I now invite the fantastic co-author of our Brazilian report, which began the symposium on Monday, Professor Thomas Bustamante. Thomas, you have the virtual floor.
Thank you very much, Joelle. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think that Brazil is perhaps in a different position with regards to almost all the rest of the world, because there is an official rhetoric, the presidential discourse and the government attitude. It's we can call it COVID-19 skepticism. So there is a boycott from the part of the federal government against the health measures that are being adopted by the legislature and by the municipalities and the state governments. So there is a clash of attitudes and a lot of confusion, and we called our country a sick constitutional democracy because of this indecisiveness and because of the many different approaches and the problems that this attitude has led to in several places in the country. We now have about 250,000 people killed by COVID-19, and I'm not sure exactly the figure of the number of the people infected, but it's last time I checked, it was more than 5 million people. So it's a lot, and there is a real risk because COVID-19 is reaching the people with the poorer incomes. Brazil is a country with a lot of inequality, with several gaps, social gaps and wealth gaps. And many people are more vulnerable, the people that depend on buses to go to work, the people that live in slums, people who don't have proper water facilities and sewerage and so on. So there is a lot of problems which makes us particularly vulnerable. We have a special vulnerability in the Amazon region because we have 800,000 people who are Native Americans. They're Indians. They still live. We don't see them often because they are up in the Amazon, but they are there. And the government initiated a campaign against vaccination and against lockout and against restriction of social and economic activity. Just to give you a sense of what happened a few days ago, some doctors and the health team, they tried to reach some Native Americans in the Amazon by boats and helicopters, and when they got there, the Indians just received them with arrows and bows, and they actually attacked the doctors, and these people were forced to leave without vaccinating these vulnerable people. And how can these things happen? Folha de São Paulo, the largest newspaper in Brazil, just showed that what happened is that religious missionaries went there before the health teams and said that they should not take the vaccines because they would be controlled by the Chinese, who would use the vaccine as some sort of a drug, and they would put some sort of thing like a silicone chip in the head of the people who take the vaccine, and they would be controlled, or they would suffer from mutations in their DNA, ADN. So there is this very powerful ideological discourse against vaccines, against health measures, against anything that can be done. So there is this problem because the president of the Republic has a very large electoral base, which has not faded since the 2 years that he has been in government. It's about 30% of the electorate, but in Brazil, this is enough. This is much more than enough to elect any president because we have a very fragmented political system, more than 35 parties. So when you have more than 30 parties in National Congress, if you manage to get 30% of the electorate, you win any election for president, and you can make large coalitions to have to be able to pass most of your plans in Congress. So what we got here is a very difficult situation because there is a lot of ideology in the approach, in the responses that are offered to COVID-19. And and this has contributed to raise our death toll and our problems. Instead of fighting for vaccines and making sure that the population is immunized against the COVID-19, what the government did was to raise doubts with regards to the efficacy of the vaccines. And when a few months ago, the health system collapsed in the city of Manaus, and there was not oxygen for the hospitals, and people were dying from car accidents, and babies that are born premature and would not have oxygen. Those deaths were not directly connected to COVID, but they were indirectly connected because the hospitals just run out of oxygen. And I think that this shows this shows a chaotic situation, which is hard to explain how we got there. So what we see in Brazil is that sometimes the Congress, the Parliament, they enact laws which are vetoed by the president, and sometimes they overturn the vetoes. Sometimes some minority parties appeal to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court declare some of the policies unconstitutional, and sometimes the state governments act with isolation measures against COVID-19. So the only reason why the situation is not totally out of control is the system of checks and balances. The Supreme Court has ruled that there is that the states and the municipalities, they have the power to determine the measures concerning COVID-19. So they determine that each city and each state can adopt its own measures against the circulation of persons and limitations on economic activity and schools and religious activities and travel and so on. So this helped us a lot because at the state level, we've managed to secure more rationality in the approach to COVID-19. Also, the legislature approved last year a social benefit of 600 reais, which is about $150 per vulnerable family. So if there are two parents, this could be doubled. This allowance helped alleviate some of the measures because these people are with very low income, and it's if there are two parents, it's more than one minimum wage. The minimum wage in Brazil is about 1,000 reais. So they offered 600 and possibly 1,200 reais for each family. This helped alleviate the total collapse of the economy. But now this allowance has finished and the government wasn't able to renew it. Actually, this allowance was established despite the government. The federal government proposed 1/3 of this value, and it was the Congress passed the allowance, the laws, the statutes, despite the resistance of the federal government. The federal government, they just wanted to keep all the shops open. He wanted to, just to give you an idea, there was a regulation, a federal law, saying that industrial facilities and commercial places, they should, people should wear masks to go into these facilities, and the government vetoed that. He said, not even a mask. There was a campaign against wearing masks, against any kind of limitation in your freedom to do whatever you want. So I think that we are struggling because we are trying to contain the federal executive. And what happened is that the executive is getting stronger rather than weaker, because he managed to get, there was an election this month, February, in the beginning of February, for the chairman of the two houses of Congress. And Bolsonaro managed to get his allies in the presidency of the two houses. So things are not very, very comfortable in Brazil. I think that we have an example of a country that has adopted an ideological response. I don't know how much time I have, so if you can warn me if there is still more time. If there is one aspect that I would like to comment on, is how okay, 1 minute left. Okay, so I would just, to use this minute, I would attract your attention to one of the paragraphs in our post at the Verfassungsblog, which is the irrationality and the rationality skepticism in Bolsonarism. I think that underlying the government's attitude, there is a conception of freedom without responsibility, in the sense that to fight COVID-19, we need a communal effort. We need to restrain our urges to do whatever we want. We need to take an approach based on reason and based on some sort of sacrifice that you do for other guys. So if you ask a 30-year-old not to go to a party because he might infect someone, normally we would expect an exercise of responsibility for this 30-year-old, but the government just discharges this guy from this responsibility and says, look, you are free to do whatever you want. You are free not to wear a mask. You don't need to take a vaccine. You can work, you can go to church, you can play sports, you can go to swim, you can go to the beach, you can do whatever you want. Don't feel committed or obliged just because some other person wants. And I think that this is a very nasty ideology, and it's very sad to see these ideas get the power that they do in my own country. Thank you very much for your attention.
That was a wonderful use of a minute with incredibly important points. We should not advocate freedom without responsibility. I can imagine that there isn't really freedom if we don't have wider responsibility to everyone else. But another very important point that Thomas has raised within the Brazilian reports, which is certainly something that I'm seeing in all reports globally, is the issue of misinformation and infodemic, and the consequences that we have at a wider global level for the lack of expert voice, the lack of truth and responsibility being communicated globally. And with similar themes, and to highlight another excellent forthcoming report, this time on India, which will be published on Friday, I'd like to invite Tulsi K. Raj to take the virtual platform. Tulsi.
Thank you very much, Joel, and everybody else who spoke in the panel. And thanks for the invitation. And more importantly, thanks very much for organizing the conversation that is very much needed in these unprecedented times. I think one of the larger ways and larger objectives by which this conversation is trying to achieve is to realize the essential purpose of academia, which is to seek truth and to speak truth to power. And I think this discussion will do the little that it can in order to achieve this objective. It seems that in recent times, constitutional democracies across the world have not been plagued with a single crisis until the COVID-19 pandemic. Nothing before it has affected modern democracies simultaneously and so universally, such as the COVID pandemic did. Now, in this test, this challenge has presented democratic nations with the test of how to deal with crisis management without compromising rights guarantees. And that has been a very, very, very significant a challenge before nations all over the world. Now, in this test, many nations have indeed marginally succeeded, and many others have not. And it follows from my argument, my overall argument in the country report and my presentation today, that India belongs to the latter camp. I have identified broadly 3 features that define the Indian response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The first aspect of this response has been absolute lack of transparency and access to information for the public. The second has been the monopoly of the executive in decision making and concentration of powers on the executive. The third has been an absolute crackdown on dissent and disagreement with the government. Now, we've heard from my friend who from Brazil, who was pointing out the general attitude of the Brazilian government, at least the initial response, which was to deny the virus altogether, deny the existence of the virus. The Indian response was primarily characterized by lack of transparency and keeping the public in dark as to how exactly is the government going to address this crisis and what measures is it going to take to deal with a global pandemic such as COVID-19. On the evening of 24th March 2020, we had the Prime Minister Narendra Modi announce to the country that the country is indeed going into a nationwide lockdown within 4 hours, with the total notice time that the public gets for making preparations for an absolute prohibition on the freedom to travel, the right to go to schools, the right to work, the right to movement, is a mere short time within which any preparation to deal with the lockdown is perhaps impossible. It is not known as to why the government could not more meaningfully be transparent about the way in which it was going to implement the lockdown and the way with which the lockdown was going to be initiated. Now, the unpreparedness of the state was extremely apparent. The prohibition on freedom of movement especially put vulnerable communities at risk, especially women, the disabled, the homeless, and most importantly, the poor people. And India, as we know, remains extremely unequal country, and the disproportionate impact of the lockdown and of the pandemic measures on the poor people has been damaging. One particular impact on migrant workers is striking. There are thousands of migrant workers who travel interstate, who travel and migrate to urban neighborhoods for better opportunities and better jobs. Since the lockdown put a sudden halt to their freedom of employment and led to shutting down of factories and other employment opportunities, they were constrained to go back to their natives, which were most often villages. Now, to deal with this, there was no welfare measures which were provided by the government, be it in terms of transport or in terms of livelihood. Now, without exaggeration, the migrant workers started walking hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. The picture of migrant workers walking with luggage, with children, for kilometers and kilometers became indeed the iconic image of India in 2020, and sadly so. The other aspect as regarding the non-transparent way in which the government dealt with the crisis was misinformation and presenting data of COVID numbers which were far removed from the actual data. There were efforts to encourage non-scientific measures to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. There were efforts to to present a false hope for a vaccine in as early as August 2020. And all these taken together present a very dishonest picture of how the government should deal with a crisis such as COVID-19, which is a very severe health crisis, and which is worrying for the public as well, as much as it is for the government. Taking into account the overall response of the government in terms of accountable governance, the government did not do very well in terms of installing public trust and in terms of encouraging public accountability. The second aspect of the Indian response to the pandemic management was severe concentration of powers on the executive. There was an executive monopoly essentially in decision making. Uh, in spite of the fact that India does not have legislation to deal with a health emergency or a public health crisis, the government chose not to adopt a legislation specifically for COVID-19. Now, it is not as if passing a legislation in any country for that matter would have resolved all the problems that are presented in a de facto emergency, but it is rather that the legislation helps in curbing some of the excessive powers that the executive will be tempted to exercise. It puts some limit on the vague powers that the government might exercise at the time of an emergency. What happened instead was that the executive went on with a series of executive instructions, be it in the form of orders, be it in the form of guidelines, and so on and so forth, instead of a comprehensive, accessible, and a clear legislation. Many of these laws defined the power of the executive in very broad terms. The discretion conferred on the executive was almost unfettered. To take an example, they also made use of some of the existing legislations to deal with the crisis since the new legislation was not passed. One of the existing legislations which were made use of was the Epidemic Disease Act, which was a law of 1897. A very small legislation with granting very wide powers to the executive. The nature of language used in the statute was that the states can exercise measures as it deems necessary to contain the epidemic. And this was all what the statute said with regard to the scope of the executive powers. This, as I pointed out, provided for a wide amount of executive discretion, which was not exercised legitimately or legally by the government. This executive decision making was aided by lack of both legislative scrutiny on the one hand and judicial scrutiny on the other. Lack of legislative scrutiny was featured by the lack of sitting of the parliament. There were 3 sessions in which the parliament sat in 2020. The sessions were either prematurely interrupted or cancelled altogether. In spite of demands from the opposition, the parliament was not convened in December 2020 when it was scheduled to convene. The judicial scrutiny, on the other hand, also fell short of the expected standards of judicial review. The courts continuously kept deferring matters to the executive. It closed petitions without assigning substantial reasons. Matters which required serious adjudication on personal liberty were evaded and closed by the courts, in particularly the Indian Supreme Court. There was a serious judicial evasion which was prevalent, and the public credibility of the court, in my opinion at least, went to an all-time low, next only to the national emergency of the 1970s. The third aspect, and I am told that I have 2 minutes to finish, is the absolute crackdown of dissent and the suppression of criticism. The pandemic, in fact, came at a very convenient time for the ruling party, since the time before the strike of the pandemic was characterized by a nationwide protest against a citizenship law, which promised to give citizenship to certain refugees outside the country, but excluded Muslims from granting citizenship. This led to widespread political mobilization, which led to was in fact withering away because of the freedom of movement restrictions of the pandemic. Now, how the ruling government in fact used the pandemic was to target and victimize persons who protested against the government during the citizenship protests, and to continuously arrest them, charge them under anti-terrorism laws, and subject them to continuous victimization and harassment during the period of the lockdown and afterwards. The suppression also enables the executive to arrest journalists. Politicians, including opposition members, were charged criminal provisions against. Students were charged with sedition and other serious criminal offenses for protesting or disagreeing with the government. So these are the three main features, in my view, which define the Indian response to the pandemic. I believe that there are also questions as to how do we move forward, and what are the possible reformative measures which could be suggested. And I think it's important to take public accountability seriously. It's important to take transparency seriously. And it is also important to take informal measures seriously, such as the importance of public consultations, the importance of respect to opposition, the importance of respect for tolerance. And these, I think, are some of the aspects which the ruling party and the other aspects of the state machinery should take note of. And on this, I hope to develop further during the Q&A session. And thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Tulsi. Again, a very key point which is brought about and really emphasized throughout the contributions that we've had so far is uncertainty. That mass migration was certainly a feature of the early Indian response because of uncertainty as to what to do, but it is by no means unique to India. The concern of mass migration is something that we saw almost throughout the world. But also a key point that is being raised by Tulsi, and I have no doubt will also be highlighted by our next speaker, is criticism and the ability to criticize government. I can say with certainty of making this my sole work and research and looking globally at responses, there's been no perfect response, there's been no perfect strategy. But those that listen to criticism, public criticism, expert criticism, and respond and reform have better strategies, have better policies, have better law. But perhaps not epitomizing exactly this point, I'll now call on my colleague and nevertheless friend from Democracy Reporting International, Jaraczewski. Jakob, you have the virtual floor.
Thank you very much, Joelle, for the floor and for inviting me to speak today. And also thank you very much to previous panelists for raising many important points, and hopefully some of mine will speak to those as well. I would like to talk about Poland as a case study to talk about three issues which represent certain trends that we see in the European Union and beyond. And I can say with certainty that those are trends and those are issues that have been identified to a certain degree in many other places, because concurrently to this fantastic symposium that we are part of now, Democracy Reporting International is working with Joelle on a rule of law stress test across the 27 EU member states, where we are trying to look at certain common trends and certain common concerns. So my presentation is kind of a teaser trailer for that. And also, thanks to this work, we'll be able to identify some items that are quite common across the board. So very quickly about the situation in Poland, to give you some context, Poland handled the pandemic in spring quite well, but the autumn and winter have been horrible in terms of deaths and in terms of the situation. So it was a very different situation of the pandemic itself, but a very little change in terms of law and in terms of how did the government react. So many of the things which I will be speaking now are universal since March last year. A couple of them only are new changes. The three problems that I want to talk about, three problems fall into three different categories. And the first category, a problem which is frequent and has been identified in several countries, although to a varying degree. And that problem is the legality of measures that are being used to combat the pandemic. As you know, probably the situation in Poland has been so that the government has not introduced a constitutional state of emergency. The state of natural disaster, which is enshrined in the Polish constitution and which should have been the ideal legal means for basing the response, has not been invoked. Instead, the government relies on a statutory state of epidemic, which is more of a kind of a mode of crisis management for the government and less of a full-blown state of emergency. And apart from that, on an array on statutory measures and measures introduced via secondary legislation, regulations and decrees passed by the government. Unfortunately, the problem in Poland is that the vast majority of measures that have limited human rights and freedoms have been introduced by means of secondary legislation by the government. The mandate for wearing masks in the public has been only enshrined in a statute in November 2020. And several of the measures being used in Poland are still being continuously refreshed, introduced, or modified by means of the decree of the government. And if you would be asking at this point whether this is fine with the Polish constitution, then unfortunately the answer is no. The Polish constitution clearly says that if you want to limit human rights and freedoms, you should use a statute, an act of the parliament. And that the secondary legislation passed by the government may be used to handle technical details of those limitations and to make some things more precise and clear. But the bulk of the limitations, the core, the outline of them should be enshrined in a statute of the parliament. And that is unfortunately not happening. And the vast majority of the measures in Poland raise serious or very serious concerns as to the legality. And in fact, courts, ordinary rank and file courts, lower level courts, both civil and criminal courts and administrative courts in Poland have begun to strike down the enforcement of those measures, have been striking down fines and punishments that have been passed by state authorities for violation of those measures, because those courts found the legal base to be dubious. So in that regard, many countries have problems. Of course, not everywhere those problems are as severe as in Poland. And sometimes those problems speak more to the questions as to the choice of the legal means of introducing the measures, or the questions of whether old laws coming from the early 20th century, for example, are still relevant and adequate for handling this kind of emergency. But the problem appears here and there and is happening throughout Europe and throughout the world. And of course, in the particular Polish case, the ways of amending that would probably entail introducing the constitutional state of emergency and switching to using the Statutes Act of the Parliament as primary means of introducing those measures and limiting human rights and freedoms. The second problem that I want to talk about is more of universal and is found throughout Europe and throughout the globe. And the problem is lack of clear exit frameworks for lifting emergency measures and from moving away from restrictions of human rights and freedoms. How and when will we lift those measures, exit the state of emergency if we've introduced one, and how do we return to normalcy? Under what conditions? What should be the benchmark thresholds? In Poland, in October, there was a brief moment when the government presented a kind of color-coded plan of moving from green through yellow, orange, red as the number of infections would rise, and then climbing down when this number would go down. And each of those color-coded tiers was associated with some degree of limitations and emergency measures. And that existed for a brief moment until the number of infections in Poland went so high that it actually would mean that the government would have to switch into the most severe tier, the black one, the national quarantine, which supposedly was entitled the most severe measures. And what happened actually, the government has quietly forgot about this idea and stopped talking about exit framework and stopped talking about how possibly it could climb down from the severity of measures. And the thing is that the people need clarity to see the light at the end of the tunnel, clarity both in terms of policy and law, and to be able to in some way predict what will happen when the number of infections is going to climb down, which restrictions will be lifted first, what kind of timetable are we looking at? And just a few days ago, the United Kingdom unveiled something that, while imperfect, is looking like a solid exit framework that gives some kind of certainty and some kind of predictability to the response to the pandemic. But of course, at the very same time, we need to be mindful that pandemic doesn't play by the rules that we set out for it. And developments such as the arrival of the new variants, the mutations, virulent strains, pose danger to any exit plans. So those exit frameworks should not raise false hopes and should be mindful of the fact that we might be today talking about possibility of lifting the measures and exiting the emergency, but few weeks down the road, we might be facing a massive outbreak of a new variant and we will have to climb back. And this is actually something that is probably being faced by many European countries right now as the new variants appear. And the third problem that I want to talk about is something that is quite unique to Poland, to Hungary, talking about the European Union, but also common to many countries across the world. And this is the problem of what happens in countries where the rule of law backsliding is present, when the checks and balances are being abolished and being removed. And those countries are facing some unique problems. And those problems, unfortunately, relate to how the government is abusing the damage done to the rule of law for various means. So in case of Poland, as most of you probably know, the Polish Constitutional Tribunal, the body that is supposed to conduct judicial review and is supposed to check the constitutionality of laws and their conformance with international standards. The Constitutional Tribunal in Poland has been effectively taken over by the government. The government has packed the Constitutional Tribunal with judges, lawyers who are sympathetic to the government. The leadership of the Constitutional Tribunal is best friends with the government and the ruling party. And there is a common perception that in any case before the Constitutional Tribunal, where the government and the ruling party would express some interest in the outcome, the tribunal is going to do them a favor and rule their way. And in that way, the government has effectively removed the judicial review over those emergency measures. Polish Constitutional Tribunal is no longer able to effectively review those measures and to strike them down in the case it would find them not conforming with the Constitution or with the ratified international treaties. That's, let's say, something that we've been already identifying for quite some time. But there's more. In September last year, something that flew below the radar of many people, I think, is that the Polish government has lodged an application with the Constitutional Tribunal and has asked the Constitutional Tribunal to review a provision of the Polish Civil Code, which provides for liability of the state for actions that the public authorities undertake based on an unlawful act of law. And what the government actually wants is for the Polish Constitutional Tribunal to take that law, examine it, and to say that, yeah, the government might be liable for acting under an unlawful normative act, source of law, but only if this unlawfulness will be found by the Constitutional Tribunal. And if the Constitutional Tribunal is going to rule and interpret that particular law in line with what the government says, it basically means that the government will be able to escape any liability for damages done by emergency measures, for businesses lost and shut down, and for any other consequences, if it will use the Constitutional Tribunal to rubber stamp its own actions by having the Constitutional Tribunal say that, oh no, this act of the government, the resolution decree is not unlawful. Sorry, no liability. So unfortunately, we're seeing something much worse than just removing an element of checks and balances and disabling the judicial review. We're seeing a weaponizing of the Constitutional Tribunal in order to absolve the government, the ruling party, of liability for any damages done by fighting the pandemic. And those are the examples of those issues, but those issues cross across the entire European Union and also broader. So what I can only conclude with is that I invite you to follow us at Democracy Reporting International and to follow our work, as we will be soon taking a closer look at what is the state of the rule of law across the European Union. Thank you very much. Joelle, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Just before we start our Q&A, I would like to remind everyone that they are very welcome as an attendee to use the Q&A function, and I already see we have some fantastic questions. But if you are joining us live from the Verfassungsblog website, first of all, great choice, it's a great site, but you can ask questions live on Twitter with the hashtag #PowerAndPandemic. Now, I have a first question for all of our speakers, which is, what would you identify as the most concerning response or development that you have witnessed in country? Martin, can we first turn to you?
Thank you, Joel. Well, to me, the most concerning development is what's happening right now. And that's related to the new variants of which Jakub also spoke, that even if knowing that the new variants are coming and what was happening in Ireland, Finland failed to act in early January. And I fear that this will cost 1,000 lives in a country which has largely saved its population so far by only 700 exits, may more than double the death toll simply because of failing to act in early January. And it also may result in a new state of emergency. If you allow, Joel, I would use the opportunity also to ask the question why I said it's an important strategic choice. Do we speak of ICU capacity or do we speak of the death toll as a strategic parameter? This is exactly the point, that when the government was dealing with the strategy against COVID in late January, already 3 weeks late, the material presented to them only told them about ICU capacity in different scenarios, but failed to tell them what will be the death toll if you chose X, Y, or Z. And I think that is a strategic failure, which also tells us why this is not a trivial question, why the actual modeling and the battle between the epistemic communities is about whether the strategy is explicitly or implicitly built on protecting ICU capacity, or whether it is for saving lives. I could give you the numbers of on Sweden, and it's very clear there that it's the people between 20 and 50 who have the freedom without responsibility. The cases are there, equally men and women. Then ICU is men between 60 and 69, and exits is women above 80 years. And there are far more women who die than women who are taken to ICU because of the different demographics, because of it's simply a different cohort of the population, those who go to ICU and those who die. I think that this demonstrates graphically that we are dealing with a serious question of what are the explicit and implicit strategic parameters.
Thank you, Martin. Thomas, over to you.
Oh, okay, Joel, thank you. With regards to Brazil, I think that there are two major concerns. Okay, the first one is that the federal government's responses are based on ideology and a political battle. He's looking for the 2022 elections. And when you have an illiberal government, an anti-liberal government, they need to have an enemy to become politically attractive. So you threat everyone who is defending social distancing measures or more restrict measures. You claim that they are communists and they're taking away your freedom. So that's not the proper response that you should adopt. So this is the first major concern about Brazil, the way that the government is campaigning against COVID in a way to keep alive some ideology that they need to remain attractive from the electoral point of view. And the second problem, which I think is related to the first one, is the lack of coordination. We have a country with 27 states. And just in my state, Minas Gerais, which is one of the largest, there are 800 municipalities. So you have the executives of the municipal governments, and we have a unified health system that was based on the UK NHS. And this unified health system is funded and run together by a cooperative schemes between the federal government, the state government, and the municipal government. So there should be a unified national health policy. And the person who was supposed to be coordinating the action of all other political entities, he's not doing it. So what we got is isolated responses from the states, isolated responses from the municipalities, isolated responses from parliament, and isolated responses from the Supreme Court. So there is a lot of lack of coordination, and I think that this makes our responses to COVID less effective than they could be. Thank you.
Thank you. And Tulsi, what's your thought on this?
Thank you. Yeah, I believe the most concerning development in the Indian background has been the discomfort with the disagreement and the intolerance that the government is showing towards the right to free speech. So during the pandemic, there were instances where journalists were critically reporting on the crisis management of the government and pointing out the deficiencies of the management and the government regulatory mechanisms. And one would hope that very often the criticisms and good reporting are helpful aids for the government to make amends in the way they deal with a certain crisis. And in India, however, a press conference was, in fact, a video conference rather, was was initiated by the Prime Minister, in which the Prime Minister told the media outlets, and I quote, that it is very important to tackle the spread of pessimism, negativity, and rumor, which is just another word for critical reporting. And we also see that that the ruling government is one which has not held a press conference for over 7 years now, except the one which was held in 2019, where the Prime Minister himself refused to answer any questions relating to governance. And this trend was continued during the pandemic, and we see a targeted violence against journalists and the right to free speech in general. And this I would think is perhaps present at all era in democratic nations, but during the period of the pandemic, this problem was particularly amplified and became extremely visible.
Thank you. Jakob, what do you think?
I would say that my biggest concern at this point, apart of course from all that I already mentioned earlier, and that's very clear, is the situation of the courts. And I do not mean the highest level courts, but I mean the rank and file, the regular courts on the lower levels. So the backsliding of the rule of law in Poland, and part of that has been the capture of the Constitutional Tribunal and exerting influence over the Supreme Court. But most of those actions were focused on the top level courts. And in the lower level courts, the actions of the government were mostly aimed at individual judges who were critical of the government and who were openly speaking up against those changes. Now, the current situation is that the lower level courts, the ordinary civil and administrative courts, they are effectively striking down punishments and fines that have been handed out for violation of COVID-19 measures, saying that those measures are illegal and saying that this acts of the government should not stand and so on. And what I'm afraid that, especially at the moment, that there will come a large number of civil lawsuits from businesses and individuals who've been affected by the pandemic and who would be claiming for compensation for the damages that amounted to a complete shutdown of their businesses. At that moment, the government may try to be a little bit more active towards those ordinary lower level courts. And we might actually see a much worse turn in the rule of law backsliding at the point when the government will turn to micromanaging those courts, packing them with loyal people and trying to influence, even on a very small level, those tiny little decisions that have massive importance for ordinary people conducting their businesses and their lives. So that might be very dangerous. And this is something what I certainly will be watching out for, and what we all should be especially mindful in the countries where we're seeing an erosion of the rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted to say that we have so many fantastic questions coming in through the Q&A, and also I see on Twitter. So thank you so much to everyone bringing them in. I'm now going to turn to some individual questions to each of our panelists. Our first question is for Martin. This is from Daniela Cipada Curadrado. I'm so sorry for any mispronunciation of any names. But Martin, how could corruption be considered in the human rights assessment that you have established in your paper?
Thanks for the question. We haven't given specific instructions how to code corruption, but I would say that it falls under at least 3 items. Corruption can be addressed as a question of legal basis for the measures, item 4B. It can be a question of arbitrariness, which is part of the equality basket in 3C, and it would also be an allocation of resources issue in basket 1, primarily the question of income support. How is the big cash flow, the printing of money, channeled into society? Is it spent towards keeping people from home and school by providing them income support in order to stop the epidemic? Or does it go to corrupt purposes? I think we will be able to capture corruption through these 3 parameters, but I do admit that we haven't written text how to do it.
And I would again keenly promote Martin's work and Martin's paper. Please do get in touch with him for expert input into this very important work. We have 2 questions for Thomas, focusing on the Brazilian response. So the first question from Gökhan Sen is, how has Bolsonaro, or rather, has there been any incidents where the government has used COVID-19 as an excuse to repress human rights? And on a related issue and a related point, this time from Hans-Peter Graver, how can political and legal institutions cope with this, with the COVID-19 pandemic? What are the more long-term effects to our institutions in this situation? Over to you, Thomas.
Okay, so first, Gökhan Sen's question. I think it's a very important point, because I did not stress this problem in my talk, but there are many opportunistic measures that Bolsonaro tried to attempt on the basis of the COVID-19 excuse. The first thing that Bolsonaro tried was to repeat Orbán solution in Hungary, which was to pass a law saying that executive legislation can be indefinitely passed by the government. The Constitution says that the federal government, the president, they can make provisional laws, which are valid only for 60 days. And they must be converted into law by a vote on Congress. If not, they lose the efficacy and all the effects are disconstituted. So he tried to turn these emergency measures into permanent laws, and the Supreme Court said, no, this is crazy, and COVID-19 would not authorize you to do that. The second attempt was that because the Supreme Court and the Parliament, they withdrew a lot of powers from the executive when they said that the measures should be jointly taken by the states and the municipalities. And the Supreme Court even said that the states can buy vaccines without the authorization of the federal government. Even vaccines that are being produced abroad or are being authorized by foreign agencies. So what happened is that the government was locked. So what Bolsonaro tried to do was go in front of the head of the miliquarters and on the top of a sound card without wearing any masks and trying to invite a coup. It sounds ridiculous, but that actually happened. And the people did not support him with this idea, but that's another attempt. And there is a more serious and dangerous attempt that is currently being done now, this week, actually, because the emergency allowance that was paid to the poor families ran out. So they are trying to pass a constitutional amendment to raise the debt ceiling to allow the government to pay this emergency allowance. But the president and his allies in Congress sent a bill to Parliament saying that, okay, we'll do that. We'll pay the allowance, but we will change the constitution to eliminate the minimum expenditure on health and education. The constitution says that 25% of income tax must be applied in education, and I think it's 12% on health. And now the government is saying that, okay, we'll eliminate that from the constitution. And that would give the federal government a margin to spend the money however they want. So that would eliminate the protection of the model of welfare state in a single act from based on a single vote. I mean, a constitutional amendment, but still an emergency legislation. And there is some resistance to this measure now. It's a big issue now. As to Hans Gravers's question, with regards to institutions, I think that Brazilian institutions are being tested now. There is a hypothesis that is normally sustained by a colleague of mine, Juliano Zaiden, who says that Brazil is going to be saved by its defects. The defects are the fragmentation of the political system. We have 30 parties, so it's difficult to get a very strong authoritarian government because there will be plenty of resistance and you can co-opt everyone at the same time. So we do not know yet, but one thing that Brazil has shown is that if you have a strong legislature and a strong Supreme Court, you can contain some of the impulses of authoritarianism, either with or without COVID, even though you still have the coordination problems that would not exist if we had a government based on reason and science. Okay, I think that this answers partly to the question. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to continue on that same question, that in a situation of widespread fear in the population, creating a wide discretionary scope for power in executive governments, how can political and legal institutions cope with this? And what are the more long-term effects on these institutions? That's from Hans-Peter. We also, to Tulsi, are going to add one more question. This is from Noor Khadim. In view of the lack of uprising, what happens after COVID? What next? What going forward? Now that we can see governments getting away with it. Tulsi.
Thank you. Very, very important question. Thanks, Noor, for the question. And it's true, and that is in fact the most important problem, which is sort of exhibited by the pandemic. So in the Indian context, we see that parliamentary sessions are being suspended at the whim of the executive. So it is not the parliament, for example, which decides that it will not convene for whatever reasons. It is the executive which denies that whether the parliament can sit at all. And that is setting a very dangerous precedent. And once the executive is able to actually do that, and it was in India, it is very likely that this trend will continue. And in spite of opposition from the other party members or opposition leaders, it remains a fact that parliamentary session just did not convene in December when it was supposed to. And another problem of the excessive measures of the executive during the pandemic is also that very often the damage is done. And this is a problem in terms of suppression of civil liberties and political arrest, where even if it is found after a long period of time that the arrest was illegal, the process itself becomes the punishment. And very often these kind of political arrests are very difficult to be remedied, because what you were deprived of was a personal liberty rather than something which could be compensated in money terms. And this is also a very peculiar long-term effect of the pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you. Jakob, two questions. First question is from Alan Malaka. How do we restore the rule of law? How do we come back from this, where there is such grave concerns? There's also another question that we were asked on remote hearings. What impact does this have for the rule of law?
Thank you very much. The question how to restore the rule of law is always a tough one, because we could go on an hour on what could be done on many levels in order to protect the rule of law. I could start with quite a lot of basic things, being informed, acting locally, thinking globally, and informing yourselves and others, and other activities. But I think that in the context of this particular crisis, I think that it's important, once the dust settles and once we are out of the most critical phase of the pandemic, to not forget what happened and not give governments a blank check for their achievement of guiding us through this crisis. Martin was very much right. This is kind of similar to fighting terrorism, and this is kind of a global war against an invisible enemy, the virus. And there is a lot of, there will be a lot of happiness, and there will be a lot of joy, and there will be a lot of relief once this is over, or at least manageable. But this does not mean that we should forget what happened, and we should especially be mindful of what the governments have done, and to evaluate them not only on the grounds of the fact that we are still alive and that our close and relatives are alive, our businesses is hopefully still running, but also on the grounds of what kind of legal means were used to combat the pandemic, what was the breach of our rights and freedoms, and what damage has been done, not only to us, but also to the people around us. And that's what I would probably say is the most important in trying to restore the rule of law after we are out of the crisis. And as for the second question, COVID-19 and remote hearings in courts, in theory, sounds like a great idea. And for the most part, we are in the 21st century. We are able to gather today, talking from various points of the world. And similarly, a court may summon people before it and to hold the hearing effectively using remote means. But I say that there is quite a lot of danger to here, especially to be mindful with respect to equality and non-discrimination and access to justice. On the one hand, we have a lot of groups that will find themselves very challenged to participate in remote online hearings before a court. Groups that are in various ways digitally excluded, be it on economic grounds, on the grounds of their reluctance to use the internet. Groups which have various technical challenges, lacking access that would allow them to take part in those hearings. But also, not only on the side of the people standing before the court, but on the side of the courts themselves. Courts in many countries, for example, in Poland, still suffer from massive issues when it comes to digitalization, when it comes to IT technology, when it comes to resources. And those courts, which are still relying frequently on 19th century methods of handling things technically, have been thrust into the pandemic and expected to hold the hearings online and to shift into the 21st century, skipping the 20th century on the way. And that is a big problem that we're seeing in Poland and certainly in other countries, where those good principles of moving things online and making people safe are encountering major problems, which result frequently in exclusion of people who should be able to benefit from this technical marvel of being able to do things online. Thank you.
In our last few minutes, I'd like to ask each of the panelists in just 30 seconds to say what they would like the attendees, those out there listening, to take away with them today. So, Martin.
I'll use my 30 seconds to address the question about the European Commission. I think it's been a great failure by the Commission and the EU system as a whole that it hasn't been able to partition its territory in a rational way to use travel restrictions. The EU Commission has been pushing for opening internal borders out of ideological commitment to the 4 economic freedoms. Had the EU been a federal state, it would of course have based its measures on reason and evidence, while now the measures have been based on ideology and impotence. Nobody has had the proper competence to use properly travel restrictions as a means of controlling the epidemic, and therefore countries are going astray. Countries like Finland are taking the matters into their own hands and closing internal borders. Thank you.
Many thanks, Martin. Thomas.
I think that this problem of ideological response, I think Brazil is leading. Now that Trump is out of the way, I think Trump supporters turn to Bolsonaro and use him as a model. And Trump is actually mimicking him and saying, look, we're still on, there are still people, our ideology is not dead yet. I think that the response is institutions. We need strong institutions to share power. And that responds to a question that we did not have time to answer from Mohammed Ibrahim about can the government force vaccines on people? The Supreme Court had to decide that in Brazil. And we wrote a post for the Verfassungsblog blog on December 23rd, 2020. So you go there and find the answer. But I think that this is more like a fake problem because most people want the vaccines. And what we have is a government that makes ideological demands, but is not able to vaccinate its population. If we keep the current pace, it will take 2 years to vaccinate the whole of the Brazilian population. And the people are desperate for these vaccines, and they cannot get it because of the incompetence of a government that only talks about ideology and enemies, invented enemies most of the time. So we need to keep people rational and help people deal with a lot of information that they receive, but they do not process properly. They should be able to do that. They should be encouraged by their governments to do that. Thank you very much. It has been a wonderful panel.
Thank you, Thomas. And on a note of keeping people rational, Tulsi, can we pass over to you?
Thank you so much. I will try to put down my final thoughts very, very quickly. The question on paternalism is interesting by Mohammed Ibrahim with respect to how much governments can force people to get vaccinated. I think it's in terms of the increased risk of the pandemic. There might be some argument for the state to say that in spite of the individual autonomy in terms of taking medicines or taking vaccines, there could be some compulsion with respect to that. And in terms of long-term effects and what we could do to sort of protect the institutions, I think informal norms play a great role. In this, it is not enough that laws are passed technically in legislatures. It's important that informal norms are also abided by states. And this is particularly important in terms of the farmers' protests in India, which are now internationally known. And one of the main grievances of the stakeholders has been that they were never consulted before the legislations were passed. And now pre-legislative consultation is a very significant step in terms of public accountability, which is technically not required to pass a law, but which was never done. And I think the takeaway, and with this I'll conclude, is showing the importance of civic movements against government oppression and intolerance. I think the hope is not even on the courts and the judiciary to sort of restore public trust and democracy, but the hope is rather on the people who have elected governments into power to restore public confidence and rule of law. Thank you very much.
Many, many thanks. And for the final word from the panel, Jakob, over to you.
So to sum it up in 30 seconds, hopefully, 3 points. First of all, the governments should use proper legal means of restricting and limiting human rights and freedoms, and should be mindful of domestic and international and regional standards while doing so. Second, the governments should try to provide us with exit frameworks to give us some degree of clarity, predictability, uncertainty as to how things will hopefully be changing for the better going forward. And third one, and probably a cliche, the government should not destroy the rule of law and remove checks and balances, because especially in Central and Eastern Europe, people should be well remembering the fact that no power, no matter how authoritarian and how in your face, lasts forever. Thank you.
What a wonderful final word to end this panel on. I would like to remind everyone that all of our presentations, all of our posts are available publicly online. Make sure to follow the Verfassungsblog as we publish new country reports every day, and look out for the commentaries where we discuss transversal global issues, global challenges that are facing us all. From my behalf, I'd like to thank our absolutely fantastic panelists for joining us at all times of the day throughout the world, and you, our attendees, for listening in. I'd also like to thank the incredible teams that I'm working with on this, Democracy Reporting International, at the Reconnect Project, at the Bingham Center for the Rule of Law at Middlesex, and more than anyone, the wonderful editors at the Verfassungsblog. They're really above and beyond in all they do.
Thank you, Joel.
Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to us this morning. And all that is left for me to say is good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.